Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia, and I have good news and bad news. The good news is that Rocco, after disappearing early last week, has been located safe and sound. The bad news is he has no recollection of his identity and insists instead on being addressed as one Vernon Spatunia. He has apparently, and I'm only going by my correspondence with the attendant professionals treating him at the Community Hospital North Behavioral Health Pavilion in Indianapolis, he has apparently come under the belief that it is currently sometime in July 1862, and that he is a defector from the Union Army who narrowly escaped the raid at Newburgh. Obviously, this is a very disconcerting and inconvenient turn of events, but nonetheless, the pod must cast on. And as we cast on, first let me be blunt about this week's episode. I was originally going to use it as an opportunity to cover a specific film, one of the most influential and highly regarded science fiction films of all time. But it turns out that doing proper justice to such a film requires quite a lot of sound investment for which, God help me, I was not able to devote this week. So instead, I'm gonna spice things up a little. The first part of this episode is going to be an opportunity for me to try to stretch the legs of this podcast and really get my listeners more involved, whether you're listening for free or are an active patron. Believe it or not, I watch a lot of movies in a given year, many of them which are clearly germane to the subject of this podcast, but which I have not watched with the specific intent of covering them. But as it happens, in the last few months since this podcast began, I have seen some either seriously good or at least seriously interesting films that I think would make for perfect topics. And rather than leaving it up to myself alone, I thought I'd open it up to a poll for patrons and casual listeners alike. Here's how it's going to work. I'm going to run through the list of film options, give you the gist of them with some liberal assistance from the trailers for the films, and then I'm going to open a poll on the Monster Craze Memoirs Patreon page. This initial poll will be open to all listeners to vote for which film they'd like to hear covered on the podcast. However, if you are a patron, I will instead invite you to directly message us through Patreon in order to register your preferred film. The reason I'm doing this is that while this episode will be made available to all listeners, I would still like to maintain a certain special privilege for my magnanimous patrons. So how it will work is that I will be aggregating the results of the general poll with those of my patrons, and depending upon your patron level, those votes will be weighed proportionately heavier. Think of it like free streamers being the electorate, whereas our official patrons are more like superdelegates. Maybe that framing is a tad loaded, given certain political controversies of our day, but I will also cynically use my outlining of this process to encourage all of you casual listeners to become full-fledged patrons. Just $1 a month will not only give you access to exclusive content, but also allow you to have a more direct relationship with the direction and content of the podcast itself. The poll will be open for a week, after which period I will reveal the results. Without further ado, let's run through our list of options. Are we delving into mysteries we weren't meant to know?
I say there are things better left unsolved.
Is mankind challenging powers beyond the cosmic barriers?
Who knows what waits for us in nature's no man's land?
Will science unleash the fearsome forces of lost worlds?
Impossible, unbelievable, fantastic. But I tell you, it could happen. It could happen. It could happen. It could happen.
Yes, it could happen. For various authorities believe that buried somewhere under the polar ice cap, in a state of suspended animation, are the awesome creatures, the leviathans that roamed the earth at the dawn of time.
Produced in 1953 by Warner Brothers, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms not only sports some of the earliest and best special effects by Willis O'Brien protege Ray Harryhausen, but also an uncompromising, atmospheric seriousness. captained by director Eugene Leray, a Ukrainian-French art director and production designer who had followed his friend and frequent collaborator Jean Renoir to Hollywood during the war period. Remaining primarily in technical departments throughout his career, he nonetheless surprisingly found a directing forte in giant monster movies, a cycle of films that he and producers Jack Dietz and Hal E. Chester pioneered with this film, becoming a direct influence upon Tomoyuki Tanaka and Akira Ifukube's Godzilla just a year later. Leray would go on to direct both The Giant Behemoth in 1959, as well as Gorgo in 1961. While The Beast is certainly not, in my opinion, as successful as those films, it's nonetheless a brilliantly executed, albeit reactionary film, adapting a story by weird fiction great Ray Bradbury into a weighty parable about the demand for mankind to ceaselessly adapt to the ever-escalating crises that he himself creates, lest he fall back to his primordial birth, crushed underfoot by his natural forebears.
Toward Mars, this rocket ship headed 35 million miles away through space. And then suddenly, radio contact was broken, and the world believed it to be forever lost.
Before George Pal's adaptation of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, before either of the first two Planet of the Apes films, there was the Richard Hearmans-produced, Edward Burns-written and directed World Without End, the story of a quartet of cosmonauts who find themselves transported to the distant future of 2508. Here, the last vestiges of human civilization live as a delicate and passively ineffectual hermit kingdom of technologically advanced subterranean catacombs, living in perpetual fear of the surface world, now ruled by bands of barbarian mutants. The narrative of the film is mostly fascinating as a work of pure chauvinist patriarchal psychopathy, as our peerless heroes navigate the tensions between them and their cowardly, suspicious hosts, all the while winning over the hearts and bodies of the society's women, all of whom remain exceptionally beautiful. One of B-movie stalwarts Allied artists' attempts at what might be called a B-plus picture, the film is shot in Technicolor and CinemaScope, giving its low-budget production an uncommonly sensuous veneer that easily rivals the technical wizardry of their major studio counterparts.
This is New York, as no man has ever seen it. Empty, deserted, its teeming millions gone. This is the setting for the most unusual picture ever filmed.
I know you're there! You're staring at me! No!
Another post-apocalyptic thriller. This one comes to us in stark black and white, and with a groundbreaking starring role courtesy of singer, songwriter, activist, and trailblazing actor Harry Belafonte as a mine inspector who gets caught in a cave-in and emerges to find himself to be, at least at first, the last man on Earth. It isn't long, however, before Belafonte encounters another survivor, a 21-year-old white woman played by Inger Stevens. Romantic, sexual, and racial tension abounds, but the real treat, besides Belafonte's central performance, is cinematographer Harold J. Marzorati's cinematography, which makes it clear that the oppressive, all-consuming vistas of this post-apocalyptic New York City is far from fantasy, but rather, in fact, is a precise allegory of the demoralizing conditions of so-called civilization, replete with its lingering prejudices and edifices of social segregation.
Is the fruit on the vine.
Down, Hollywood.
Now look, kid, let's get something straight right now. You're the one that wants to be a star, not me.
You don't love me anymore. Hit me.
And all the American boy sings his way into...
Okay, this final option is a curveball. There are no monsters, no gothic horror, no science gone wrong. There's just a boy and his guitar. That boy is played by Arch Hall Jr., whose short-lived career as a B-movie character actor was largely a product of his father, Arch Hall Sr.'s own passion.
We can't have that. He wants a girl. Get one for him. Nothing could shake him.
Hall Sr. produced several films through the early to mid-60s as star vehicles for his son, including the hot rod youth flick The Choppers in 1961, the monster film Ega in 1962, and the 1964 spy comedy The Nasty Rabbit. Hall Sr. himself appropriately plays an unscrupulous talent scout and music promoter whose plans for the instantly magnetic Hall Jr. involve coercing him to do a lot of things he doesn't want to do, and to cut off all ties to his loved ones, including the whimsically adorable Nancy Czar. The film was co-written by Hall Sr. under the pen name Nicholas Merriweather, but it's also notable for being the first film directed by the late Ray Dennis Steckler, one of the true original outsider directors. One of the most marginal, saccharine, and infectious examples of the youth picture and rock musical, Wild Guitar may not qualify in the strictest sense for the podcast, but it certainly has that bizarro factor that leaves it, at the very least, a spiritual kin to the rest of our survey.
From Fairway International Films, the swingingest picture of the year. See Arch Hall Jr. and Nancy Czar in Wild Guitar.
Well, there you have it, folks. 4 films for you to choose from. A foundational giant monster flick, 2 post-apocalyptic thrillers, and a goofy soda fountain wannabe. So if you're not a patron, keep your eyes peeled for that poll. If you are a patron, go ahead and hit us up as soon as you can. This episode isn't over yet, however. I've still got a very special treat for you all. I feel really bad that I wasn't able to do a proper film breakdown in time, but I think I'll do you one better. Or rather, Rocco's going to do you one better. For while he's infirm at the moment, I have nonetheless found myself in possession of an anthology of 4 short stories that my father wrote while he was in high school, somewhere about 1967 and 1968. I have no idea what's in these stories, but I read the first one a long time ago, though, and it was quite an experience, just getting an unalloyed glimpse into the mind of my father as a teenager. I won't read the first one because it's more of a straightforward detective story, but the next one, Skimming It, that seems to be right up our alley. So let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll crack open these dusty old, decades-old pages and get right into it. Stay tuned. The second story, To Kill Perchance to Live, by Rocco Carcia. Her cane landed hard against the smooth, bone-white cement path that led to her Hollywood estate. At the top of the hill it stood, a mammoth construction. When she was younger, she enjoyed her walks from the plush Los Angeles suburb office to the shiny black iron gates, she and her husband. He died 10 years ago, and every day since has been a bitter struggle. Not that she wasn't well off, but she hated to compromise her intelligence. She had always backed her ideas. Every day since his death becomes another battle. But even more severe, every day carries with it the summation of 10 long years, and a little more force and certitude is required to counterbalance the growing phantom, the impending doom of overthrow. She thought of their life together as too complete to have children. Now the loneliness was unbearable. It made each day that more horrible. The thought of the proverbial last straw frightened her. It wasn't the business. She had money. It was the loss of control to exercise, with all her charisma and diplomacy, negotiations and settlements. But now, at the age of 62, she has become more vulnerable to accusations from the trustees, the stockholders, and bankers. Age wasn't something she could correct. It faced her every day, but it was thrown back at her time and time again by her associates. She has remained dauntless till now. The burdens of the day make her bones creak and head ache more now than ever before. Even more horrible, she hated the house. What once was the epitome of her and her husband's dreams was now a gargantuous, grotesque prison. Why wasn't he here now to defend her? If he were here, age would be an honorable process, a maturation of wisdom, she thought. She rested against the iron gates. A chauffeur with a black limousine had been waiting, reading a paper. He removed a key from his vest and opened a metal box which housed a button. Upon pushing the red button, the gates rolled back. He escorted the old woman into the car. As they drove off, the gates closed automatically. Lavish flowers bordered the white quartz stone path to the home. They arrived at the front of the white colossus, a shell of a home, where loving memories have turned rancid. A sharp knee pain caused her to lean against the cold, smooth, dead-white pillars. The chauffeur took her by the arm. "I can make it myself," she shouted, wrenching her arm away. The chauffeur remained expressionless and opened the solid oak door. The lion head knocker was tarnished, and one of the jeweled eyes was enucleated. She had always enjoyed polishing it. She would never, and still, despite its decrepitness, will never let anyone tend to it. She kept it as the reflection of her torment. As they entered, the massive door was closed and the sound reverberated through the still air. The crystal chandelier twisted and chimed from the disturbed air. It cast a musty yellow light that filled the room. The chauffeur opened the immense grandfather clock. The glass door was badly tarnished, and the hands on the face were soldered at the time of her husband's death. He removed the tarnished, static pendulum, and offering force to the back of the clock, an opening was made. He backed up to allow the old lady to squeeze through the oblong darkness. The chauffeur followed, concomitantly replacing the pendulum and closing the back of the clock, which fit flush with the dimensions of the clock interior. A dimly lit, narrow spiral stairway led to an average-sized door. She opened it, pushing with her cane. The bright light of the subterranean room caused both of them to squint and grimace. The old woman was panting. Claustrophobia nearly overtook her every time she descended the shoulder-width stairway. The room, for its size, housed many scientific and medical apparati, neatly compartmentalized within the limited dimensions. It was initially built as a fallout shelter in the early 60s. "John, we must act now. They are asking me to resign as president, she said as she removed her black hat with trembling fingers. The chauffeur's lower lip quivered before he spoke. Mrs. Stacy, I don't know if I'm ready to... I don't care, she snapped with tears in her eyes. She folded her arms to her shoulders, caressing them as she whimpered. She turned her back to him. They're closing in on me. She wiped her tears without removing her bifocals. She sniffed and regained her composure. Now, everything is arranged. My estranged niece from England will be beneficiary of the estate and business. My lawyer completely trusts me, and a will stating as such has been issued. It's in the safe. She opened her pocket and scrounged for an unused tissue. The chauffeur looked away and removed his cap. His copious black hair maintained its integrity, except for a forelock which he pushed back with his hand. You know what must be done, he said with his brown eyes gazing down at the floor. He kept his eyes fixed on the tiled pattern, and repeated a little more forcefully, You know what must be done. Yes, she whispered softly, still with her back to him, blotting her nose with a silk handkerchief. It will mean murder! He raised his eyes. She spun violently and was goaded with anger. Oh, yes, you telling me about murder. Remember where you are coming from, young man. A scientist turned criminal, she shouted. That was an accident, he shouted with rage, pounding the operating table. Oh, yes, she laughed sarcastically. It was an accident, by your laboratory antics. Don't call my procedures antics. How dare you? The whole thing is off, he shouted as he began to storm out of the room. I'll be the one who will call anything off, she retorted, grabbing his arm and spinning him around. Remember, $8 million of my personal funds are invested here, she shouted, pointing to him in the face. Disgustedly, he turned away with an internalized temper. You'll do exactly as I say. Remember, you have no choice, she added emphatically. Mrs. Stacy approached him. If you should leave prematurely, or if I die, either way, a life sentence awaits you, she said softly yet forcefully. But, she raised her nodular, pointed index finger, if it's a success, $2 million and freedom, young man. She rubbed him on the back. Now let's stop this. Let's think positive. It will be a success, she said, smiling. He turned and produced a small half-smile and nodded affirmatively. She didn't know what to look for. Mrs. Stacy sat at the table alone. The single glass-encased candle emitted a red hue. Women were leaning on men's shoulders in a slumber, some laughing, others unconscious with mouths ajar. Then a shadow caught her eye. A magnificent specimen of a female entered and occupied a remote bar stool. She wore a black dress, simple in design, which clung perfectly to her voluptuous form. The woman brushed back her dark brown hair. It was shoulder-length and curly. When the young woman moved, her breast remained firm and undulated softly, a beautiful substrate for the triple-row catenary of pearls. Despite her black dress, her aureole added to the ornamentation, to which the dress clung tenaciously. She ordered a double doers on the rocks, and sipped it teasingly. A handsome man approached her, stumbling. He was inebriated. As he talked, he caressed her left breast with his glass. Her chilled erect nipple carved an arabesque in the condensation of his glass. It was only then that the old woman saw her in full view. The young woman rose from the bar stool. She stood fairly tall and was quite sleek. She had a prominent button nose, bordered by large, soft eyes that were set closer to the nose than normal, a feature that gave the woman a surreptitious, feline aura. With a sharp slap, she knocked the drink from his hand. Her face remained expressionless, except for a slight glare and prognathous pose. The man laughed and staggered from side to side. Then he placed his hands on her shoulder. Mrs. Stacy could not believe her eyes. With almost effortless force, the young woman seized the man by the lapels of his sports jacket and flung him on an unoccupied table, which crashed under his weight. There was a temporary hush in the crowded bar as a disheveled, large bouncer picked the man up and escorted him outside. The ordeal was endured stoically by the beautiful woman, who took her drink and moved to a sequestered table in the far corner of the room. Such control, stamina, and finesse. Such intransigence in the face of a threat. Yes, this was to be the one, thought Mrs. Stacy. Mrs. Stacy, trying to remain inconspicuous, made her way to the bar. The bartender, typically, was drying glasses. "What do you have, lady?" he asked. "Please, sir," she said, covering her lips and smiling. "I want to surprise my niece. She's sitting over there in the corner." She gave a false laugh and pointed. "Oh yeah, the real frisky one," laughed the bartender. "Takes after her mother," she said softly, giggling. "Could I have a double brewers over ice?" she asked smilingly. "For my niece," she added with a childish snicker. The bartender laughed and made the drink. Mrs. Stacy grabbed his hand and inserted a $20 bill into his rough palm. "Keep the change," she pinched his cheek. "Thanks, lady," the bartender said jubilantly. The old woman waited for him to become preoccupied with the customers. Then she reached into her black leather pocketbook and retrieved a small vial containing a concentrated solution of chloral hydrate. Looking around, she inconspicuously opened the vial and poured a quantity into the drink. She was about to close the vial, but she thought of the ordeal before. "Her strength," she whispered to herself, biting her lower lip. She looked around once again and emptied the entire contents of the vial into the drink. The mixture produced eddy current shadows on the bar. "Oh, sir," she whispered forcefully. The bartender approached and cocked his head to listen. "I've decided to keep it a surprise a while longer. Could you have someone take this drink to her?" she asked smilingly. "Sure, lady," he said. Mrs. Stacy watched as the beautiful woman looked around and simultaneously spoke to the barmaid. The barmaid, typically chewing gum, shrugged her shoulders and left the woman. The subject tapped the glass and thought a while. Then she began to drink discreetly. Mrs. Stacy, sipping a Bloody Mary, kept her eyes fixed on the woman. With time, the old woman grew impatient. "How long does it take to work?" she asked herself, and tapped her cane impatiently. The subject had finished the scotch and was rubbing her forehead. With difficulty, she rose, grabbed her pocketbook, and made way for the door. Mrs. Stacy rose from the stool and followed stealthily, tapping her cane softly. Outside, the attractive woman clung to a telephone pole, blinked her eyes hard, and rubbed her face. Innocently, Mrs. Stacy approached her. "My child, are you all right?" she asked, grabbing the woman's arm. I'm not sure," replied the young woman, who looked very pale. Come and sit here in my car. Perhaps you'll feel better." Mrs. Stacy escorted the staggering beauty and sat her down in the passenger's side of the Cadillac. "How do you feel?" Mrs. Stacy asked as she brushed back the woman's hair. The vivacious brunette opened her mouth to speak, but no words came forth. She stared glassy-eyed at the old woman, then collapsed on the old woman's forearm. Mrs. Stacy looked to see if anyone was watching, and tucked the woman's legs into the car, closing the door gently. She then scurried to the other side of the car, entered, and drove away with her captive. Mrs. Stacy paced in her study, her cane tapping bluntly on the plush rug of crimson. The chauffeur entered the study, but now he donned a laboratory coat instead of a chauffeur's apparel. "Well, John?" she asked apprehensively. "Fine specimen," he answered, folding his arms and leaning against the wine cabinet. "Better still, the same blood type," he said, smiling. "Then it's all settled," she said with relief, sitting halfway on her large oak desk. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this?" he asked seriously, pointing a finger. A tear came to her eye. She had the feeling of rejoice Yet she was afraid. Yes, I'm sure, she said warmly, her lips quivered. After all, I have no choice, really. She gazed at the carpet. It's a risk? She paused and looked at him. For both of us, dear doctor. He nodded, with pursed lips. The room was lit brilliantly. Silvery instruments reflected the light like jewels. He gazed at the two nude specimens on the intensely white tables. The old woman's dry skin hanged loosely over her knobby, arthritic skeleton. It was a perfect model of senescence. The doctor covered his face with a mask and put on gloves. He glanced at the perfect female specimen before him. With regards to the young subject, he was mainly concerned with preserving the features. Her body would provide a beautiful shell for Mrs. Stacy's brain and sense organs. Making an incision on both sides of the trachea, he isolated the major vessels going to the head. Then he cannulated them, and connected the appropriate cannulae to a machine which would aid the woman's heart during the operation. He walked to the chart which contained the least possible number of incisions that would be necessary to remove the brain. Reflecting the scalp and overlying musculature, a major section of the skull cap was removed with the aid of a bone saw. The skull cap was placed in a special physiological solution. Grossly, he removed the brain, enucleated the eyes, and cut out the temporal bone housing the hearing apparatus. The cribiform plate was also cut out, since it would be replaced by Mrs. Stacy's olfactory unit. The entire procedure took him under 3 hours. He stabilized the heart machine in synchrony with the autonomous woman's heart. Next, he moved to the old woman. Similar cannulations were performed, except that they were directed towards the head. Temporary cannulae directed towards the body were connected to another machine that would provide a blood pool for the head. After the machine was filled, the entire head was removed, and the old body was allowed to exsanguinate into the laboratory drain. He stabilized the second machine to provide critical nutrients and recyclable blood containing oxygen. The doctor watched to make sure that the pressure to the brain of Mrs. Stacy didn't fall below the critical closing pressure. With Mrs. Stacy's head, he could cut it grossly, but a fine dissection of the brain was critical. First, he tied off the superficial vessels leading to the face musculature and skin. Then, he grossly removed a large section of the cranium and exposed the dura mater. This would provide a fibrous sac in which he could conveniently transport the brain. He exposed the vertebral canal and severed a cord below the atlas bone. Through the roof of the mouth, he freed the pituitary complex from the sella turcica. Also, he freed the cribiform plate and a complete section of the temporal bone housing Mrs. Stacy's hearing apparatus. Cranial nerves were followed and dissected out to provide length. The eyes were removed by sawing slits from the orbit to the cut surface, so the entire eye complex could be lifted out with the brain. He lifted the brain by the blue-gray dura mater and carefully placed it in a solution with the cumbersome cannulae attached. The eyes responded to light, a good sign. A steady flow of anesthetic was relayed by cannulae into the vessels going to the brain. It would be a terror worse than death if Mrs. Stacy's brain were to wake and see her hideous form. Despite the fact that he had been working 10 hours, the most crucial step was yet to come. The placing of Mrs. Stacy's brain into the young woman's body. Every nerve had to be aligned as closely as possible to maximize proper innervation. For this, he needed a special instrument, one he had constructed with the old woman's funds. Most of it was an amplification system and screen. There were variable size rings, with jacks to hook up to the machine and also an intricate lever system. The rings could fit around any size nerve. These rings would create a potential, which in turn would set up a current in the nerve. The generated current in the nerve would produce a magnetic field. Each neuronal magnetic field would be picked up and amplified by the rings and machine respectively. A picture is produced on the screen which displays the axons. The cut surfaces of the young woman's cranial and first spinal nerves, and also the spinal cord, were displayed. Then, the nerves of the Stacy brain are scanned until there is a very close matchup in the neuronal patterns. The nerve is then cut to that point. The nerve endings are then placed together and locked in position by precise lever arms. The lever arms could also rotate either donor or recipient ends until the closest overlap is produced. The rotations are done thermally, with a computer memory, to attain movements as small as 50 angstroms. A computer also determines the closest overlap. When the red ready light appears, the neurons have been matched within 5% error. The green button saying spot is then pushed. In the ring there is a row of 100 microscopic lenses capable of focusing a minute laser beam. Each laser beam scans the cut surfaces of the opposing nerves and spot welds the cytoplasmic membranes together. As each neuron is welded, the computer subtracts out of the display. Within the hour, the bulk of the axon spots had disappeared from the screen, and the maximum welding had occurred. Thus, the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and the spinal cord were fused. The doctor lowered the eyes into the grooves and sutured the muscles and conjunctiva. Then he inserted the cribiform plate and temporal bone sections, sealing each with bone wax and cement. The rest involved replacing the skull cap, suturing the skull muscles, and suturing the scalp into position. The vessels from Mrs. Stacy's brain were then sutured to the woman's body with bypass cannulae in place to facilitate blood flow. The woman's heart beat strongly. Most important was the addition of an anti-rejection fluid that he had formulated. The fluid, temporarily, reverts the reticuloendothelial system to an immature state for a brief period of time. Thus, any new tissue is recognized as self instead of foreign. It was an earlier mixture tested that would have sent him to the electric chair, if not for Mrs. Stacy's insatiable thirst for youth. 3 days, the disfigured creature remained unconscious. John looked worried. Even if she did pull through, despite his fantastic expertise with the scalpel and instrumentation, he would not be able to perform the delicate plastic surgery to restore beauty. John turned off the machine, hoping that the rising CO2 levels in the blood would force the respiratory centers to fire. The chest and abdomen quivered irregularly in an attempt to breathe. He stabilized this anomaly by inserting a tracheal cannula and hooking it to the breathing apparatus. It would be just a matter of time for the nerves to heal properly to facilitate normal breathing patterns. By the end of the week, the Friday night, Mrs. Stacy stirred occasionally, indicating some consciousness. John removed the breathing tube and respirator. She breathed easily now. Mrs. Stacy slowly opened her blackened eyes, forming narrow, intensely dark, watery slits. "Doctor?" she asked with a hoarse voice, yet simultaneously smiled, because she heard. A new voice! She knew the operation was a success. He smiled at her and opened his chart. John asked her to perform a barrage of physical tasks with her new form, which she executed quivering with difficulty and pain, yet successfully. He smiled and nodded. She laughed quietly and cried. Mrs. Stacy noticed a troubled look in the young doctor's smile. "What's the matter, John?" He bit his lower lip and forced a half-smile, patting her hand. "We seem to have a persistent problem. A relatively minor one, actually," he said with a reassuring voice. "Tell me," she said with exhaustion. "I can't seem to account for your slight anemia," he said with concern. "For the past few days, as you lie unconscious, it has progressively worsened, but not to a dangerous point." "I wouldn't worry," he added. "I'm going to give you a transfusion." He patted her hand and smiled. John rose and walked to a large metal refrigerated cabinet with thick glass windows. He reached into his lab coat pocket and took out a key which unlocked the cabinet. John removed a packet of blood, set it up, and inserted the IV. "There, that has it," he said, looking over the transfusion. Suddenly, A red flasher interrupted the intense white of the laboratory, indicating someone at the gate. "Now I want you to lie quietly. I'll be back in a few minutes," he said, smiling. Mrs. Stacy smiled and nodded. As the doctor left, she remained smiling, gazing at the ceiling. Suddenly, the smile left her face. She felt strange, her heart pumped violently and quickly producing a heavy feeling upon her chest. As the blood bag waned, the pains of her assembled flesh disappeared. Her head began to pinch, and she tore off the bandage cap. To her surprise, stubbles of hair had appeared and were growing rapidly. She remained still and closed her eyes with fright, allowing the changes to occur. Muscles twitched violently. She sweated profusely. Her heart entered periods of intense tachycardia, followed by bradycardia. With almost the same rapidity of the onset, everything stabilized. Mrs. Stacy felt a great warmth and calm flood her body as the independent functions synchronized. She felt very invigorated, yet very relaxed. Mrs. Stacy sat up in bed and rubbed her face and head. Scars that had formed a rough, tortuous terrain at the border of her scalp had vanished. Then she removed the IV and walked around the bed, brushing her hair out of her sweating face, trying her weak footing. The doctor entered the room, squeezing through the narrow oblong doorway. "It was just one of the board men." "Mrs. Stacy!" he shouted, advancing slowly. She looked up at him quickly. She was frightened, and she breathed irregularly. She was afraid that she might have been dreaming. She forced out a few words. John, is it true?" She laughed and cried jubilantly. Astonished, he rushed towards her and grabbed her arms. "Sit here!" He sat her on the bed. To his amazement, all the incision points were completely healed. More astonishing was that her body was more youthful and voluptuous than the original donor's. I can't understand what happened," he exclaimed, raising a trembling stethoscope. "Ha! The old bag is dead. Old Teresa Stacy is gone," she laughed sarcastically. "Quiet! Be still!" he shouted as he listened to her heart. "I'm Laura Stacy now, her estranged niece," she exclaimed. "Wait till the board members see their new head," she laughed. "Oh, stop fooling around with that thing!" She slapped away the stethoscope with the mannerisms of an older woman. "I feel great!" she exclaimed. "I can't understand it. The rapid healing," he said with amazement. "How could a simple transfusion cause such a transformation?" he asked rhetorically. "Oh, John," she put her strong arms on his shoulders. "Youth! A new lifetime!" She grew excited and ran her trembling fingers through his dark, curly hair. As she grew more ecstatic, John grew more troubled. She grabbed him by the lapels of his lab coat. "John, please! More blood! Oh, please, John!" she breathed heavily. "I must feel the full effects." "No! No more blood!" he said defiantly, shaking his head vigorously. He put his hands on her shoulders. "First, let me find out the nature of this rapid change," he said calmly. "Ha!" she laughed sarcastically. "Do you think you can bring me this far, just so you can do more tests and experiments?" She gestured strongly. "I must have more blood. Will you give me the transfusion?" She pleaded angrily, grabbing him by the arms. "No, not yet!" He rose abruptly, breaking her hold. "All right," she said forcefully. "I'll get it myself." She slipped quickly into the negligee and made way for the blood cabinet. He walked backwards stealthily to the drug cabinet, opened it quickly, and prepared a syringe of sodium pentobarbital. She tried the door to the refrigerated cabinet, but it was locked. "Where's the key?" she asked angrily with her back to him. Her nostrils flared, although she contained her anger. He approached her with the syringe and cotton, licking his lips nervously. "Don't you see? You're too excited. Let's discuss this later when we can proceed slowly in considering your recovery. Please give me your arm," he asked apprehensively. She turned to him slowly. Goaded with anger, she extended her right arm. "Certainly, doctor. You're very right to stop me. We must proceed with caution," she smiled. Suddenly, she slapped him with a backhander that sent him spinning into the refrigerated cabinet. In his attempt to recover his balance, John toppled the cabinet onto himself, crushing his legs. Blood packets were cut from the broken bottles of plasma and IV solutions. She screamed, raising her hands to her face. Her eyes were opened wide. Frantically, Mrs. Stacy prostrated herself over the crimson pool, attempting to lap up the blood. "No! No, the blood!" she cried silently. "Please! Please help me! I think my leg is broken!" cried John, grimacing. The expression of pain left his face as he gazed, astonished at the sight of the frantic beauty, trying to salvage the clotting blood with her tongue. There was a sudden, dead quiet except for the trickling of escaping solutions from the overturned cabinet. Her straggly hair covered her face as she rocked slowly on her knees, as if she were in pain. She looked up at John slowly. A transformation had occurred. Her eyes were cross-hatched with red, winding vessels, and her pupils were of fire. She then hissed, exposing 4 sharp canine teeth that glistened brilliantly, spelling death. She rose up off the floor, and with a single hand lifted the refrigerated cabinet and sent it flying into the wall. "Oh my God!" he pleaded. "No! Please! Please!" She seized him by the throat and squeezed. He gagged and tried to swallow. His eyes bulged out of their sockets and tears streamed down his cheeks. His tongue protruded from his mouth and saliva flowed freely from the edges. John's face was florid, then turned purple. Suddenly, he feebly scratched and punched, trying to break her grip of steel. John's body went limp. That was unconsciousness. Mrs. Stacy felt the strength burst from every pore, a blind animalistic feeling, demoniacal yet lovely. She smiled sardonically as she raised his limp form, effortlessly, holding John by the neck. Then she shook him until several audible snaps were detected. With each snap, his body twitched. Like a rag doll, she flopped him onto the operating table. Her intensely red eyes fixed on his pulsating carotid artery. She inched toward it, with mouth wide open. As the creature thrusted her fangs into the vessel, the blood spurted into her mouth as fast as she could swallow it. She drank the blood, occasionally sucking and chewing to keep the vessel patent. When the flow diminished, she massaged his sternum, depressing it so far that some of the ribs snapped. She tried to squeeze every available drop from his body. It was over. Her eyes danced with delight. The blood gored the edges of her mouth and coursed a tortuous path down her chin and neck. Suddenly, the creature felt faint. She tried to fight, to resist the spell. She shook her head, but she collapsed to the floor. The few minutes she lied unconscious felt like hours. She suddenly awoke, like a person escaping a nightmare. She breathed hard and her heart pounded. Mrs. Stacy was afraid to look and turned her head reluctantly. She raised her hand to her mouth to stifle a scream as she saw the doctor's bloodless countenance, with glaring eyes staring at her. She rose quickly off the floor and ran to the locker, frantically retrieving the donor's undergarments and black dress. She got into the clothes quickly and tripped as she tried to simultaneously run and put on the woman's high-heel shoes. Squeamishly, with hand raised to her face, Mrs. Stacy squeezed by the corpse and ran through the oblong darkness up the narrow stairway. She gazed at herself with horror in the tarnished full-length mirror in the hallway. "No," she cried, frantically rubbing off the gored blood around her mouth. "It can't be! It wasn't real!" As she wept, she ran, plucking the keys off a badly warped coffee table. Mrs. Stacy flew out of the house, leaving the door open, tore the car door open, and stormed away. The blue smoke and disturbed dust hung still in the silent night. She drove for hours, blindlessly, just trying to think things out, plucking her curls. "When will it happen again?" she cried silently to herself. She knew it wasn't a dream. It wasn't that she didn't know what she was doing. She knew that she was killing. She wanted to kill, and she enjoyed it. Mrs. Stacy came to an abandoned road outside Los Angeles, and upon passing it she slammed on the brakes, bringing the shining Cadillac to a screeching halt. She swallowed nervously. There was a compulsion to try the road, a compulsion that was somewhat subconscious. She had never been out that way before. She backed up and slowly drove up the convex, badly paved road, An incline grew sharply as the road conditions worsened. Twisted trees and bushes anthropomorphically beckoned to her. Then she saw it, at the very top of the hill. In the background, the silver setting moon cast a black light effect on an abandoned, decrepit house, old yet massive, horrible yet welcoming. Mrs. Stacy advanced slowly. The car rocked over the unevenness of the road. She was taken aback. It was a monstrosity of construction, decrepit and colossal. Mrs. Stacy stopped the car, but kept the piercing cones of light fixed on the house. Just about every opening was boarded over, except a side entrance where a few middle panels, about 2 feet off the ground, were removed, exposing a good section of the entrance. She got out of the car and rubbed off the remaining opalescent tears from her stinging red cheeks. "Why am I here?" she asked herself silently, shaking her head with bewilderment. As she pushed back her dampened hair, she noticed that it was shoulder-length now, the way the woman's was, that God-forsaken night. She stepped carefully, holding the black dress and supporting herself on the edge of the car. The grass was tall and laden with gossamers that were heavy with the early morning dew. Her breath condensed in the cool air. She approached the opening, cautiously, and stepped slowly over the remaining panels that covered the lower third of the doorway. The moon was in opposition with the sun. As it set beneath the horizon, the eastern sky synchronously lightened. It now was a deep blue with the approaching dawn. The musty air filled her flared nostrils. The house had been unoccupied for a long time. However, she noticed recent tracks in the dust that covered the creaking floorboards. They were those of a woman's high-heel shoes. The entrance faced the eastern sky that was progressively lightening. The stars diminished as the blue crept to the zenith. The side entrance led to a short hallway and terminated with the other side of the house blindly, except for a boarded-up window. 2 rooms connected with the hallway. One was immediately to the right, and the other was almost at the end and to the left. Mrs. Stacy entered the first room stealthily as the warped door creaked. The dawn light revealed a room containing some old desks, pieces of a bed, and a broken vanity. The birds began to chirp with the rising sun. She stepped out of the room. The side opening and blind corridor faced the east directly. Now, an orange orb of light began to permeate the blue sky. Mrs. Stacy clung to the door frame and gazed at the emerging sun, perhaps to find some security in its rays. But she grew apprehensive, and she breathed heavily. She became terrified. She wanted to run. Her body twitched to run, but she remained steadfast. In an instant, just as the sun pierced the horizon, a stabbing pain sent her flying back, landing hard against the blind wall. "Oh my God!" she screamed as she fell heavily to her knees. Her hands were raw and gnarled. The skin was falling off. When she rubbed her face in agony, whole sections of cadaverous skin slowed off. The smell nauseated her. In hysteria, she watched the solid ray of light creep down the wall. Frantically, she tried to crawl into the shadow casted by the remaining door panels. She looked back and saw whole clumps of her curly dark hair that had fallen, turned gray, then shriveled to nothingness in the path of the dust-laden ray. The hot ray overcame her feet and engulfed them, turning them to ashes. She screamed. Upon moving her legs, her shriveled feet fell off and crumbled to dust. Her dress slowly deflated as the sun showered its disintegrating rays over her thighs and hips. She dug into the warped floor with her nails in an attempt to pull herself to safety, but her gnarled hands failed her. Then she glared into the second room, which was now to her right. The dim light revealed a richly designed coffin. The lid was open, beckoning. It was her refuge. Mrs. Stacy raised her arm in anguish and clenched her fist in defiance. The deadly rays crept onto her back. Her arm dropped to the floor and rolled from its socket. She watched it disintegrate almost instantaneously. Her torso melted to the floor, and she gasped as her lungs collapsed. Eyes and teeth fell from the head as it was consumed. All was turned to dust. A gentle breeze stirred the ashes. The coffin plaque shimmered in the darkness. It read, Princess Yvonne Tepes, 1436-1462. The Bride of Dracula.